My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 76 years old, a widower, and a former U.S. Navy veteran who spent most of his life believing that family comes first. For 6 years, I lived alone in the outskirts of Kerrville, Texas, after losing my beloved wife, Margaret, to cancer. The small ranch house we'd shared for 30 years felt too big, without her laughter echoing through the rooms. But it was home. It held our memories, our dreams, and everything we'd built together. I've always been a man of few words, proud of my independence. During my time in the Navy, I learned that actions speak louder than words, and that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is through silence. But age has a way of humbling even the strongest among us. My arthritis made simple tasks like opening jars nearly impossible, and my balance wasn't what it used to be. The stairs to the second floor became a daily challenge, and I found myself depending more and more on the kindness of my 2 adult children, Darren and Melissa. If you enjoy stories of cold-blooded revenge and gripping plot twists, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new, unreleased stories here every day, each one more intense than the last. But kindness, I learned, was something my children had forgotten how to give. Darren, my 45-year-old son, worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company in San Antonio. He made good money, drove a BMW, and lived in a gated community with his wife and teenage daughter. Melissa, my 42-year-old daughter, was a real estate agent in Austin, always dressed to impress and constantly talking about her latest commission. Both had inherited their mother's sharp mind, but somehow missed out on her compassionate heart. Since Margaret's passing, family dinners became obligations rather than celebrations. My children would visit on Christmas, Easter, and my birthday, always with an eye on their watches, always with somewhere more important to be. Their conversations were filled with subtle suggestions about my declining condition and not so subtle hints about how I should consider my options for the future. The breaking point came last spring during one of their rare visits. I'd prepared Margaret's famous pot roast, the one recipe I'd mastered after her death, hoping to recreate some warmth in our family gatherings. But instead of enjoying the meal, Melissa spent the entire dinner scrolling through her phone, showing me listings for senior living communities in the area. "Dad, you're getting confused more often," she said, not even looking up from her screen. "Last week you called me 3 times asking if I'd heard from Mom. You know she's been gone for 6 years, right?" I remember setting down my fork, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. "I know exactly how long she's been gone, Melissa. I was asking if you'd heard from your mother-in-law about Thanksgiving plans." Darren jumped in with his usual bluntness. "The point is, Dad, you're not as sharp as you used to be. These senior places have nurses, activities, people your own age. You wouldn't be so isolated." "Isolated?" I asked quietly. "You know what I mean," Darren continued. "It would be more practical for everyone involved, and you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house or what happens if you fall down those stairs." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my children painting a picture of inevitable decline and presenting assisted living as the only reasonable solution. They spoke about me as if I wasn't sitting right there, discussing my future like I was already mentally incompetent. I listened to every word, and I remembered every detail. What they didn't know was that I'd been keeping a small notebook, documenting each visit, each conversation, each moment of dismissal. Margaret had always said I had a sharp memory, and military training had taught me the importance of maintaining accurate records. I wrote down dates, times, and exact quotes. Not because I was planning anything specific, but because something deep inside told me that someday these details might matter. That night, after they left, I sat in my recliner looking at the family photos on the mantel. Pictures of birthday parties, graduations, holidays, all the moments when we'd been happy. I wondered when exactly my children had stopped seeing me as their father and started seeing me as a burden to be managed. I was about to find out just how much of a burden they really considered me to be. 3 weeks after that dinner, everything changed. I was sitting on my front porch, watching the Texas sun set over the hill country. when the mail carrier handed me an official envelope bearing the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, not from age, but from anticipation. I'd been waiting for this letter for almost 3 years. The VA's investigation into toxic exposure during my naval service had finally concluded. Agent Orange, chemical contamination, years of breathing in substances that the military later admitted were harmful to personnel. The compensation settlement was substantial, $290,000 in a lump sum, plus a permanent increase to my monthly military pension that would boost it from $1,700 to $3,200 per month. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having at this stage of my life. But instead of calling my children immediately to share the news, I made a decision that would change everything. I wanted to test something. I wanted to see if there was any genuine love left in my family relationships, or if their recent behavior was truly indicative of their feelings toward me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my bedroom safe, right next to Margaret's jewelry and our important documents. Then I sat down and made a plan. The Weather Channel had been tracking a severe storm system moving through East Texas, with predictions of heavy rainfall and potential flooding in the Hill Country region. Kerrville sits in a valley, and our neighborhood had experienced minor flooding before, though nothing truly dangerous. But the meteorologists were calling this system unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. I picked up my phone and dialed Darren's number first. "Hey, Dad." "What's up?" His voice carried that familiar tone of mild irritation, as if my call was an interruption to something more important. "Son, I'm watching the weather reports, and they're predicting some serious flooding in our area over the next few days. You know how this old house sits near the creek bed? I'm feeling pretty weak lately, and I was wondering if maybe you or Melissa could come stay with me until this storm passes." There was a pause. I could hear the sound of his BMW's turn signal clicking in the background. "Dad, come on. You've lived in that house for 30 years. You know how these weather people exaggerate everything for ratings. It's just rain." "I know, but this one seems different." The County Emergency Management Office sent out a notice recommending that elderly residents in flood-prone areas consider staying with family or friends. I just thought, "Look, Dad, I've got a huge presentation tomorrow for a potential client. Sarah's got her hands full with Emma's soccer tournament this weekend, and honestly, you're probably safer in that house than driving around in this weather. If something serious happens, just call 911. That's what emergency services are for." I thanked him quietly and hung up. Then I dialed Melissa. "Daddy, hi. I'm actually showing a property right now. Can I call you back?" "It's about the storm warning, sweetheart. The Weather Service is predicting severe flooding, and I was hoping one of you kids might be able to come stay with me for a day or two." "Oh, that. Yeah, I saw something on Facebook about it. Dad, you're being dramatic. Remember Hurricane Harvey? Everyone thought Houston was going to wash away and most of the city was fine. You've got your landline, your cell phone, and Mrs. Rodriguez next door if you need anything. I've got 3 showings tomorrow and a closing on Friday. This is my biggest commission month ever. I understand you're busy, but Dad, you're tougher than you think. You survived Vietnam. You can handle a little Texas thunderstorm. Besides, isn't this exactly why we've been talking about senior living communities? Places where there's always someone around in case of emergencies? After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the growing wind outside. I made myself a cup of coffee and opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, July 2025, Storm Warning Test. Below that, I documented both conversations word for word, including the times, dates, and my children's exact responses. Margaret's wedding ring sat on the kitchen counter where I'd placed it after her funeral, unable to put it away, but unable to keep wearing it. I picked it up and held it to the light, remembering the day I'd proposed to her in 1970, right before my first deployment. She'd waited for me through 2 tours of duty, supported me through the nightmares and the readjustment to civilian life, and stood by me through 43 years of marriage. "They're not the children we raised, are they, Maggie?" I whispered to the empty room. By the next morning, the storm had intensified beyond even the meteorologist's predictions. The creek behind my house, usually a gentle stream where Margaret used to feed the ducks, had swollen to a rushing river. The rain hammered against the windows with a violence I'd rarely seen, and the power had been flickering on and off since dawn. I tried calling both children again, but neither answered. I left voicemails explaining that the situation was deteriorating, and that I was genuinely concerned about the rising water levels. I mentioned that several neighbors had already evacuated to higher ground, and that the local news was now calling it a 500-year flood event. Neither called back. By afternoon, the water had reached my back porch. By evening, it was seeping under the back door. I moved what I could to the second floor and waited, hoping that my 40-year-old house would hold together long enough for the storm to pass. That's when I discovered just how wrong I'd been about everything. By midnight, the water on the first floor of my house was knee-deep and rising fast. I'd managed to move some essentials upstairs: medications, a few changes of clothes, some crackers, and bottled water. The electricity had gone out completely around 10 o'clock, leaving me with only a flashlight and the battery-powered radio Margaret had insisted we keep for emergencies. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. The National Weather Service had upgraded the situation to a flash flood emergency, and the Kerrville Fire Department was announcing that several neighborhoods, including mine, were now inaccessible to emergency vehicles. They were advising residents to move to the highest point in their homes and wait for rescue teams with boats. I tried my phone one more time, but there was no signal. The cell towers were apparently down. Even if I could reach my children now, I wondered if they would come. For 48 hours, I lived in my upstairs bedroom, watching the water rise to within 3 feet of the second floor. I rationed my crackers and water, used an old bucket as a makeshift toilet, and listened to the radio for updates. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort. I'd endured far worse during my Navy days. The worst part was the silence from my family. On the second day, I heard voices outside, and the sound of something scraping against the house. I looked out my bedroom window and saw a small aluminum boat navigating the flooded street. At the oars was Eduardo Martinez, my 34-year-old neighbor who lived 3 houses down. Eduardo worked construction, sent most of his paycheck back to his family in Mexico, and had always been friendly despite our language barrier. "Mr. Walter," he called out in heavily accented English. "You okay? You need help?" I opened the window and called back, "Eduardo, the water's too high, it's not safe." No, I come get you. Is dangerous here." Eduardo had somehow acquired a canoe and was paddling through water that was moving fast enough to carry away cars. He'd already rescued 2 other elderly neighbors, he explained in broken English mixed with Spanish, and wasn't leaving anyone behind. Getting me out of that house was like a military operation. Eduardo tied his canoe to my front porch and helped me climb out the second-story window. My arthritis made every movement painful, but his strong hands and patient encouragement got me safely into the boat. As we paddled away from my home of 30 years, I watched the water swallow the first floor completely. Eduardo took me to the Red Cross shelter at the Kerrville High School, where volunteers had set up cots, hot meals, and a communication center for displaced residents. The shelter was packed with families, elderly people, and anyone else who'd lost their homes to the flood. Eduardo made sure I had a bed, helped me register with the Red Cross, and even brought me a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich. "You have family?" he asked, sitting beside me on the cot. "2 children," I replied, "but they live far away." Eduardo nodded, understanding. "My family in Mexico is hard when family not close." What Eduardo didn't know was that my children lived less than 2 hours away. They just didn't care enough to check on me. The Red Cross volunteers helped me contact Darren and Melissa through their emergency communication system. I left messages with both of them, explaining that I was safe, but that my house was completely flooded, and I was staying at the emergency shelter. I asked them to call the shelter's main number when they got the messages. 3 days passed, no calls. On the 4th day, a local TV news crew came to the shelter to interview flood survivors. They were doing a human interest story about community members helping each other during the disaster. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Collins from KSAT San Antonio, interviewed several people, including Eduardo and me. "This is Walter Hensley," she said to the camera, a 76-year-old Navy veteran who was rescued from his flooded home by his neighbor Eduardo Martinez. "Mr. Hensley, can you tell us about your experience?" I kept my comments brief and focused on Eduardo's heroism, rather than my own situation. But the story aired that evening on the San Antonio news, and apparently, someone my children knew saw it. Darren and Melissa showed up at the shelter the next morning, full of apologies and explanations. They rushed through the door of the gymnasium with tears in their eyes and dramatic expressions of concern. "Dad, oh my God, we had no idea it was this serious." Melissa grabbed my hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "We tried calling you, but the phones were down. We drove here as soon as we heard." Darren was equally theatrical. "We saw you on the news last night. Dad, why didn't you tell us how bad it was? We would have come immediately." I looked at both of them calmly. "I did tell you. I called both of you before the storm hit. I called again when the flooding started. I left messages at the shelter asking you to call. But Dad, you know how unreliable cell service can be during storms," Melissa said quickly, "and we were dealing with power outages too." "The shelter has landlines," I replied quietly, "and the messages I left were 3 days ago." They exchanged a look that I recognized. It was the same look they'd given each other during the assisted living conversation, the look that said they needed to get their story straight. "The important thing is that you're safe," Darren said, changing the subject. "We're here now, and we're going to take care of everything. You can't stay in this shelter. You'll come home with one of us until we figure out what to do about your house." "Actually," I said, standing up from my cot, "I've already made arrangements." For the first time since they'd arrived, both of my children looked genuinely surprised. "What kind of arrangements?" Melissa asked. "I've decided to relocate to Austin. I've spoken with a real estate agent about finding a suitable place, and I'll be hiring a full-time caregiver to help me transition to a new living situation." This was partially true. I had spoken with a real estate agent, but not for the reasons they assumed. "Dad, that's great," Darren said, though his enthusiasm seemed forced. "But wouldn't it make more sense to stay with family while you're making these big decisions? I mean, you've been through a traumatic experience." "You're absolutely right," I replied. "I have been through a traumatic experience, and it's taught me exactly who I can count on when things get difficult." I gestured toward Eduardo, who was helping an elderly woman with her medication across the room. "That man risked his life to save mine. He didn't ask what was in it for him. He didn't check his schedule first. He just acted." My children followed my gaze and for the first time seemed to actually notice the man who had rescued their father. "We should thank him," Melissa said weakly. "Yes," I agreed. "We should." But I could see in their eyes that they were already calculating the financial implications of my newfound independence and my plans to move to Austin. What they didn't know was that I was calculating too. 2 weeks later, I was settled into a beautiful single-story house in South Austin, complete with wheelchair accessibility features and a spare bedroom for my live-in caregiver, Clara Hayes. Clara was a 58-year-old former nurse who had cared for her own elderly parents before they passed. She was kind, competent, and genuinely interested in my well-being rather than my bank account. My children had no idea about the VA settlement money. During those awkward conversations at the shelter, I'd mentioned hiring a caregiver and relocating, but I'd let them assume I was using my regular savings and pension. They seemed relieved that I was handling things myself and wouldn't be a financial burden on them. What they also didn't know was that I'd already contacted my attorney, Robert Williams, who had handled Margaret's estate. Robert was a straight-talking lawyer who'd served his own time in the Army, and he understood exactly what I wanted to accomplish. "Walter, you're absolutely certain about this?" Robert asked during our meeting in his downtown Austin office. "Once we execute these documents, there's no going back." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied, signing the new will and trust documents. "Every decision I've made has been based on how my children actually behaved, not on what I hoped they would do. The new will was simple and clear. Darren and Melissa were completely removed as beneficiaries. Instead, my estate would be divided as follows: $100,000 to Eduardo Martinez and his family, with a note explaining that heroism deserves recognition. Another $100,000 to the Veterans Foundation of Texas for programs supporting elderly veterans. The remainder, including the house, would go to Clara Hayes, who had shown me more genuine care in 2 weeks than my children had in 6 years. I also set up a small trust fund to cover Eduardo's children's college tuition, managed by the same bank that handled my military pension. Robert assured me that everything was legally bulletproof and that my children would have no grounds to contest the will. "There's one more thing," I told Robert. "I want to make sure that Darren and Melissa understand why these decisions were made. When the time comes, I want them to receive copies of my notebook documenting their behavior, along with a letter explaining my reasoning." Robert nodded approvingly. Accountability is important. People should understand the consequences of their choices. Over the following months, I settled into my new life. Clara and I developed a comfortable routine. She helped me with medications and physical therapy, drove me to medical appointments, and prepared meals that were both nutritious and delicious. More importantly, she treated me with dignity and respect, always asking for my preferences and including me in decisions about my daily life. I made new friends in the neighborhood, including other veterans and retirees who appreciated good conversation and shared experiences. I joined a book club at the local library and started volunteering at a food bank for senior citizens. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely useful and valued. My children called occasionally, usually when they needed something or wanted to check on my living situation. I kept our conversations brief and polite, sharing general updates about my health and activities, but never mentioning the VA settlement or the details of my new estate planning. During one of these calls, Melissa casually mentioned that she'd been researching reverse mortgages and wondering if I'd considered that option to help with my living expenses. Darren, during a separate conversation, suggested that I might want to consolidate my assets to make things easier for when the time comes. Both conversations went directly into my notebook, with dates and direct quotes. The real test came about 8 months after the flood, when I had what appeared to be a minor heart episode. Clara immediately called 911, and I was taken to St. David's Medical Center in Austin for observation. The doctors determined it was just a reaction to a new medication and nothing serious, but I was kept overnight as a precaution. I specifically asked Clara not to contact my children, explaining that I didn't want to worry them over something minor. But somehow, word got out through the hospital's patient information system, and both Darren and Melissa showed up the next day. "Dad, we came as soon as we heard," Melissa said, bursting into my room with flowers and a concerned expression. "How are you feeling? What did the doctors say?" "They said it was nothing serious," I replied calmly. "Just a medication adjustment. I'll be going home this afternoon." "That's such a relief," Darren said. "But Dad, this is exactly what we've been worried about. What if this had been serious? What if Clara hadn't been there?" "But she was there," I pointed out. "She handled the situation perfectly." "Still, it makes you think about the future, doesn't it?" Melissa said, sitting on the edge of my bed. About making sure all your affairs are in order? About who you can really count on when things get difficult?" I looked at both of them, really looked at them, and saw the same calculating expressions they'd worn during the assisted living conversation a year earlier. They weren't here because they were worried about my health. They were here because they were worried about their inheritance. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly. "It does make you think about who you can really count on." 3 months later, I peacefully passed away in my sleep at the age of 77. Clara found me the next morning, and according to my wishes, I was cremated with a simple memorial service for my friends and neighbors. Eduardo spoke beautifully about the importance of helping others, and Clara shared stories about our daily conversations and the wisdom I'd gained from my military service. Darren and Melissa, of course, attended the service and played the part of grieving children perfectly. They spoke to the gathered friends about their beloved father and how much they would miss him. They had no idea what was coming. The reading of the will took place the following week in Robert Williams' office. I had specifically requested that my children be present, along with Clara and Eduardo. The expressions on Darren and Melissa's faces when Robert read the actual bequests were everything I had hoped for. "This can't be right," Melissa said, her voice rising. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Robert replied calmly. "Your father was very clear about his intentions. He also left these for you." Robert handed each of them a copy of my notebook, along with a letter I'd written explaining my decisions. The letter was brief but comprehensive. "To my children, Darren and Melissa, the decisions reflected in this will are based entirely on your own choices and behavior. When I needed you most, you were too busy with your own lives to help. When I asked for basic companionship and support, you suggested I pay strangers to provide what family should freely give. When I was in genuine danger, you ignored my calls for help. Eduardo Martinez, a man who barely knew me, risked his life to save mine. Clara Hayes, who had no obligation to me beyond a professional relationship, treated me with more dignity and respect than my own children showed me in 6 years. I am not punishing you. I am simply ensuring that my legacy goes to people who demonstrated the values that matter most: compassion, loyalty, and genuine care for others. You both have successful careers and comfortable lives. You will be fine without an inheritance. My money will do more good in the hands of people who understand what it means to truly care for others." The room was silent for several minutes after Robert finished reading. Eduardo looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting such a substantial gift. Clara was crying softly, overwhelmed by the recognition of her dedication. Darren was the first to speak. "We can contest this. Dad wasn't thinking clearly after the flood. He was traumatized, probably suffering from PTSD or depression." "You're welcome to try," Robert said matter-of-factly. "But I should mention that your father underwent a complete psychological evaluation as part of his estate planning process. He was found to be completely competent and clear-thinking. There's also extensive documentation of his reasoning, including recorded conversations with me discussing his decisions. Any legal challenge would likely be unsuccessful and expensive. As I had hoped, my children eventually accepted the reality of the situation. They couldn't contest what they couldn't disprove, and they couldn't disprove the documented evidence of their own behavior. Eduardo used his inheritance to start his own construction business and moved his family to Austin, where his children excelled in school and eventually attended college on full scholarships. Clara continued working as a caregiver for other elderly clients, using her financial security to be selective about the families she worked with, ensuring she could provide the best possible care. My story became something of a legend in the veteran community around Austin, not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the most profound statement you can make is through the choices you make about who deserves your trust and resources. The flood that nearly killed me ended up saving my life in ways I never expected. It showed me who I could count on when everything else was stripped away, and in the end, that knowledge was worth more than any inheritance I could have left behind. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive alerts for new stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.